Oh, no.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Go ahead and get.
You're talking, Dr. Brooks. Commissioner Brooks.
You're muted.
Thank you. One day we'll get this right. And so I was going to say, Christian, do we have everyone here to get started?
We don't have Commissioner James yet. I haven't heard from her either way, so I assume she's on her way.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to wait a couple minutes for her.
Yeah, how about we just give it maybe 2 or so more minutes.
Okay.
Folks can jump on and see if she can join us. But and while we're waiting, I just wanted to remind folks that for the presentations, so if we could keep them to about 20 minutes max so that we can have some discussion afterwards, that would be really, really great. So with that being said, I will at least start us. And so thank you all so much. I would love to convene today's policy committee meeting. What we're going to be doing today is covering policy JKA, which consists of behavioral interventions and student discipline, as well as policy EBBB in terms of incidents reports. So we're excited to hear more about particularly policy JKA, and looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about that. And so we'll spend about 20 minutes in presentation, and then we'll leave enough time for a robust discussion after each piece. And so I will pass it off to who's leading us for the policy JKA?
Myself and Dr. Brooks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I pass the mic to you all.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lori Hines, and I'm the Director of Student Conduct and Attendance, and I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Deborah Brooks, who is the Executive Director of Special Education. And so today we will be presenting to you. Can you all see my screen? Yes? No?
Yeah, yes, I can see it on my end.
Okay, great. Okay, so today we will be presenting to you policy JKA, the behavioral interventions and student discipline policy, along with the regulations that go with it, which are JKRA through JKRE. This policy, we have worked extensively on this policy and the regulations. If you recall, last school year, this policy went through the board. It went through this policy committee. It went to a first reader, a second reader, and it was scheduled to go for you all to vote on it on a third reader. At that time was exactly when COVID hit, when it was scheduled to be voted upon. And so we started the process all over this school year, and we've gotten some additional revisions. We've worked very closely with our legal department. I see that Josh is on, and so huge kudos to Josh and his team. We've worked closely again on this policy and the regulations, and we are resubmitting it to you all on today. So we are excited about it, and let's get started. So again, as I stated, we are revising this board policy JKA, and the reason that we did some alignment this year, a lot of the work that we did this year with it was to actually align the policy with current district practices and our state laws. There was a new, as you know, equity policy that came out last year, and so we wanted all of our policies that our board policies within the city to be in alignment with one another. So we made sure that JKA was in alignment with that. We formed a cross-functional work group to develop the guidelines responding to the changes in state laws. And that work group was across several different offices within district office, one of the main offices being special education and legal, but there were other offices as well. And so again, we just wanted to be in compliance, and not only in compliance, but also in alignment with our state law. So our state law says that pre-kindergarten through second grade, there are pre-K through second grade suspension limitations. And so I'm sure that you are familiar, because this was also last year, that through the law, suspension is prohibited in that grade band, except when there are certain requirements that are met, such as when a student brings a firearm to school. And so in the event that a suspension can happen, a student can be suspended for up to 5 days, but what has to happen, there are some criteria that has to go along with that. So the school administrator, in consultation with a mental health professional or a school psychologist, they have to make a determination that there is an imminent threat of serious harm to either other students or staff members that cannot be reduced or eliminated through interventions and supports. And if that determination is made, then in those events, we can give suspensions to students in grades pre-K through 2. However, again, it must be limited to 5 days. In our practices, we have very much limited that. We really haven't done up to 5 days. In the events, we've done to 2 days. And in addition to that, we have designated one-on-ones when we were in person that we assign to the students, so that they wouldn't have to have any suspension out of school days, but that the students could remain in school while we worked on a program plan for the student to return. Also, additionally, school administrators are required to not only develop, but also to monitor interventions prior to a student being suspended in that particular grade band of pre-K through 2. Another state law that was passed was in regard to restorative approaches. And so the State Board of Education, it states that they are required to provide technical assistance and training to school districts regarding the use of restorative approaches. And so the state law defines restorative approaches as a relationship-focused student discipline model, and it has certain aspects that go along with it. And so I'm not going to read them for you, but you can see the different aspects that have to be met in order for it to be a restorative approach. Previously in our policy and our regulations, we refer to them as restorative practice methods. And so we've changed that language so that it can be in alignment with our state law. And so our policy, and the regulations now refer to them as restorative approaches. This slide I'm going to turn over to Dr. Brooks. This talks about our restraint and seclusion, which is in our policy and regulations.
So yes, so also good afternoon, everyone. The state law also required that the State Board of Education form a task force to consider the following. And so again, as Ms. Hines said, around restraint and seclusion. And so we had to, the state law stated that they had to consider under what circumstances restraint and seclusion would be prohibited, and also identify those school types that the restraint and seclusion would be prohibited. Also defining positive behavior intervention and strategies and those supports, the behavior intervention plan, and also what professional development would look like for staff that would be implementing these positive interventions, as well as any type of restraint and seclusion, what that professional development would look like for those staff that would be implementing it. Also, most importantly, who would be actually giving authorization for restraint and seclusion for students that would need the type of support. So we know that in order for a student to be restrained, there must be parental consent, and helping parents to understand when they're given that consent, what that actually allows for, and when those restraints would take place and when it would be appropriate for that to take place. Also, looking at the minimum requirements for policies and procedures to be developed by the local school system, public agencies, and non-public schools. And then also the standards for monitoring the compliance for those local school system, public agencies, and non-public schools. And then considering where to address by the task force that was developed by the state board that convened by the Maryland State Department of Education.
Okay, so I'm going to just go through the next few slides, just highlight some of the major revisions that took place with our policy JKA and then with the regulations JKA through JKRA. So of course, we're starting with the policy. And of course, I've already mentioned this one, that the definition of restorative practice methods, we've changed that language throughout the policy and the regulations to reflect that of the state law. And so we renamed it Restorative Approaches. Also, we have aligned, again, all of the language with state law, and we have added lots of equity language to the policy. Proposed revisions to the first regulation, which is JKRAB. We had, again, a cross-functional team that reviewed the regulation JKRAB, and we proposed revisions to its exclusion, physical restraint, and seclusion guidelines that Dr. Brooks just discussed with us. Also, city schools proposed a revision to actually prohibit seclusion. So that was major. The rationale for that revision was that just nationally across our nation, states are beginning to prohibit the use of seclusion, and just seclusion, it just didn't align with our city schools practice of restorative approaches. So we have actually put in the regulation that in city schools, seclusion is prohibited. In JKRAB, again, as I discussed, we are limiting the suspensions of pre-kindergarten through second grade students without consultation of first a mental health professional or a school psychologist at that school, and for them to consult with the administrator and actually to make a determination together if there is an imminent threat of serious harm to other staff, other students or staff members. That cannot, that part is very important, that cannot be reduced or eliminated through interventions and support. Also, it clarifies the language for an administrative transfer for safety and security concerns. And then also we added in JKRAB an appeals process for short-term suspension. So previously in our regulation JKRAB, which deals specifically with suspensions and expulsions, you would find the appeal process for like long-term suspensions or extended suspensions, but there was no written language. We had our own like in-house process of what we did if a parent or a family wanted to file an appeal. However, it was not written anywhere. And so we actually put that in writing for short-term suspensions in JKRAB as well. Proposed revisions to JKRAC. There were many technical revisions to this regulation. We changed the name of Office of Specialized Services to what it is currently, the Office of Special Education and Student Supports. And so that you will see that throughout that regulation. Also, we suggested that a referral for a manifestation meeting by the IEP team when a removal approaches 5 days instead of 8 days. So we know that the law says that a manifestation meeting must be held by the 10th day. However, previously in our regulation, we had that a manifestation as a best practice should happen by the 8th day. And so now we have changed it to be even more stringent. And now we say that a manifestation meeting must be held by the 5th day. And the reason for that is oftentimes when students are proposed for an extended suspension, by the time they get to our office, those days have already passed. And so if a child is either suspected of having a disability, or if they actually have a disability and they have been suspended for 5 days already, we want to make sure to ensure that it is not, you know, a manifestation of their actual disability. We want to find out and be able to put the proper supports in place for those students. And we don't want to have to wait until 10 days because that's like a whole 2 weeks out of school for students. So we've also added that. Proposed revisions for JKRAD. Again, there are many, I'm going to turn that one over, I'm sorry, to Dr. Brooks.
Not a problem. So we also wanted to make sure that we included general guidelines for students with disabilities. And most importantly, we wanted to make sure that we added the language for our students who have a Section 504 plan regarding alternative educational settings, placements, and also clarify the start of the suspension or expulsion so that we can make sure that we have the appropriate interventions and supports in place for our students with disabilities.
Yes. And when we say clarify the start of a suspension and expulsion, you would see the language in there that said like when the remove, like when a child is removed. And so the removal, again, we wanted to really hone in and clarify when does that official, like when we say the child is removed, when does that suspension or an expulsion begin? Okay. And Dr. Brooks, that
yes. And here we wanted to make sure that we referenced other administrative regulations for alignment purposes and consistency purposes. So just as Ms. Hines spoke and said that we've had an equity policy that has now been approved, we wanted to make sure that the language was consistent across our regulations, as well as adding language to for students that were suspected of a disability. So there was consistent practices for those students as well. And also to make sure that, again, that we're providing restorative approaches for our students and interventions and putting supports in place for all of our students.
So, as I stated earlier in the presentation, we have worked very, very hard on this policy and the regulations. A lot of time has gone into this, and we have had a lot of engagement. Now, because we are virtual this year, again, as I stated earlier, last year, we went and we had all of the engagement with the parties that you see here on your screen, and how we engage with them is also written in blue. And so, again, I'm not going to read them out with you, but we had like several sit-down meetings with them, several work meetings with them. We went to them, we made presentations, they came to us upon request, we sent policies over, we had back and forth through emails, and we took into consideration everything that was suggested to us and came to some conclusion. And so we were quite confident that when we would come to third reader, that it would be approved and everyone's suggestions and recommendations had been taken into consideration and included within the policy. And then again, as I stated, COVID hit us. So when we came back this year, we honed it even more with the alignment of the various other policies that we have within Baltimore City. And so I think that is even a stronger policy. But before we brought it to you all, we wanted to, again, go back. So even though we took their recommendations and their considerations last year and incorporated it into the policy and the regulations, we want them to see how we have included the, the equity language and aligned it with other policies. And so we have sent out, emailed to these various stakeholders that you see here to get their input. We have not got it back because we just did that. And so we're asking for their input on what we are presenting to you on today. And then as we get it back, we will, if there are any further recommendations or considerations, we will certainly take those into consideration before we come back for first reader. And I believe that is all. So at this time, if you have any comments or questions, we will be happy to take those at this time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I want to just turn it over to my colleagues to see if we have any questions. Do we want to start with Chair Chinia? If you have any questions.
I really don't have questions. It was pretty clear for me, but I'm assuming that when you said you sent back the draft, you meant January 2021?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Just since we've been back from the break, we've just sent out the policy and the regulations with the updated changes to see if they have any further changes, because again, we had very intense sessions with them and meetings last year.
Okay, good.
But
and I just want to say, thank you for what you've done in terms of including other policies. I was especially happy to see the inclusion of students with the 504 plans, which I think at times have been overlooked. So thanks for that one.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going in order in my screen. Commissioner James, questions?
Sure, thanks. My first question is on JKA, Roman numeral 1 belief statement, capital letter A, where we say that the Board of School Commissioners is committed to the whole child supports. There's nothing in there about academics. So whole child supports and services that encompass academics, wellness, climate, so that it's not seen as an add-on, but is seen as the fabric of how we do business with young people. So I'd love to see that modification made if possible. If that doesn't align with our Office of Whole Child, since you're in the middle of my screen, my dear, we could have another conversation about that. But if it does align, then I'd like to see it there, and I hope it aligns. My other is in letter K in that same section, or under purpose, under definition, sorry, in that same policy. With expulsion, it's listed as one of the highlighted changes is with notice to the student's parent. So perhaps with notice to the student's responsible adult party or guardian, parent seems to limit us to the realities that our students may be experiencing. Now that may be law that's borrowed directly from Comar, so I don't know that, but would be great. And then question about re-entry. So it doesn't seem in the regulations about any clear statements for a process for re-entry after a suspension or an expulsion. And in my conversations with principals and with teachers, the kid was out and then they just poof appeared back. And so in order to uphold the actual purpose of restorative practices, considering, and I know we don't want to lock ourselves into you must have or you need to have, but a general guidance document on reentry that it should happen not automatically, but should be intentional in order to support the student's success. Because I've often seen in well-meaning colleagues, a student is suspended or dismissed for an extended period of time, they show back up and they come back in without any healing for that teacher either. And so then that teacher ends up being, not intentionally marginalizing of the student, but the end result is the same, that the student encounters a negative experience. So both to protect the students in reentry as well as to provide support for teachers and principals, spelling out, here's some best practices in reentry or some compliance, like, did you send an email to say kids coming back tomorrow? Something. And I don't want to put on what those should be, but it seems to be a missing piece in this document. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Commissioner James. Commissioner McFadden?
Thank you, Dr. Brooks, and thank you to the team that's been working on this. I love the idea of cross-functional teams working on policies. I think it's the way that we should be developing and drafting policy. So I just want to, preface my statements by saying that and thanking you all for the work that you've been putting in this policy over the past couple of years. I saw the revisions that you listed, and as I was going through the policies, I'm curious to know, because you did update the purpose of the policy to include some of our equity language. How would you all say that this particular policy and the regulations align to the equity policy? How can you all speak to that? And what are ways that we are going to see that translated in the policy and also in the regulation? What would you all say to that as the composers of this particular policy and regulation?
Ms. Hines, would you like me to start?
So go ahead. You can go ahead.
Okay. So I'm really grateful that you asked that question, because I think across all of our work that we're doing in any way related to student wholeness, and this work is, right, while discipline and suspensions are not what one would maybe think of as a wholeness approach, it is one of the entry points, I think, in our system and our processes through which we can start to shift our focus towards more whole child approaches and more equitable approaches. So one of the things that's happened over the course of the past year and a half is much more orientation towards really focusing in on the disproportionality in our suspension practices and figuring out, not only as we look at the data around race, but also around special education status and students who have an IEP, we are disproportionate, particularly in those categories. We know it, it's a problem, and we have to root that out. So we've worked in close cooperation with Dr. Brooks and her team. One of the things that we do together, well, it's functionally runs out of Dr. Brooks's office, but it's something we sort of oversee in close partnership, is our CCEIS funding and work. And that is specifically designed to get at issues of disproportionality. And as we have done that work together, we've been doing root cause analysis and then putting in place strategies to provide training and coaching and support, particularly for our school leaders around discipline practices, around restorative practices, to try to shift more of our approach away from the punitive and more towards the restorative, but also starting to build in some equity-oriented training to help people think about it and look at it from that point of view. So that CCEIS is just one example of that. We have also, it's required by the state, but not something we're just doing for compliance purposes, but we had to also come up with a broader plan for how we address that disproportionality in our system. And as we move forward, certainly in terms of our work around the whole child office and student wholeness, one of the things that I'm continuously focused on is how we integrate that work around social emotional learning, restorative practices, healing-centered practices, and equity. Our goal is to build a robust model that helps people see how all of those things are deeply connected. And we're spending more and more of our time working across not only the offices that are here today, but also with Dr. Durant and her team to make sure that we are weaving those things together. I would say it's admittedly still a work in progress. We've been also looking at other districts to see how they may be doing that integration work and where things are successful. I'm pretty excited that in the past year, I think one of the things that's been helping us drive that work forward is our work around restorative practices. And strangely, I guess not strangely, but the pandemic, for all of the horrible things that it has brought, has opened up some possibilities that we've been really trying to grab onto as opportunity to expand our reach with that work related to restorative practices, social emotional learning, healing-centered practices, and equity. For example, in a district-wide training that we did for all school-based staff in the fall, that was run by our partner from ACOBEN in restorative practices. We're doing similar types of work through healing circles with principals, with teachers, and increasing professional development around these issues. So we're sort of full steam ahead on that work right now, but it is certainly a work in progress and something that I'm excited to hear you asking about it, because we really want the district leadership and board to be our partners in this.
I appreciate that, Dr. Warren. I didn't know if any of the others, because you passed it on. I didn't know if anyone else wanted to add anything before I moved on.
All that I was going to add, thank you, Sarah, for mentioning all of that to include CCEIS. But I also just wanted to add, as you know, we have really focused on the de-escalation training to really work with school teams, school leaders, even our bus aides and our bus drivers, our cafeteria workers, all of our support staff on how to de-escalate our students in a positive way, so that it's not punitive, a more restorative way, and also looking at this with all of our work through an equity lens, and having those conversations, and looking at our children as complete people, and thinking about their experiences as we enter into conversations with our students, and even de-escalating some challenging behaviors. And so even as we continue this work through our work with our disproportionality around discipline, even over identification of students with disabilities, but in the lens of really thinking about where our students come from, their backgrounds, some of their experiences, and how we interact with our students. So that's what I just wanted to add.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Brooks.
And if I could just add one last thing, as Dr. Brooks said, the disproportionality plan for race and special ed came out of our office, but we worked very closely with Dr. Brooks on that plan. And then I will also say the staff of student conduct and attendance. So specifically the specialists that hold the suspension conferences. We have been intentional about equity training for them, as well as restorative practice training for them. So they've had the training as well. And they, I will say, like, as their leader, I'm very proud of them and just the mindset and even the suggestions that they reach out and try to work with the school. I've pushed very hard in our office that it's not like us against them, that we are partners for what's best for children. And so that work has, I will say, has really, really progressed. And so now, instead of, schools feeling like, oh, it's district office against, us, they'll call us like for suggestions or for recommendations so that we can work together with the students. So
I appreciate that. And as many of us that are present in this meeting know and clearly understand that true equity work, it really is a cultural shift. And it seems like in a lot of the policies that we're starting to see drafted and come before us to be approved, that the policy is the beginning, right? It's nice in theory, it's nice in thought, but it also can be used as a roadmap to help us go where we know we need to go in a city like ours, in a community like ours. And I'm very happy. I was really happy to see the edits and the changes as you all speak about the disproportionality, right? But the over-identification of young people, Dr. Brooks, I know is something, I mean, everyone is into that, but especially in our particular city and school system historically, generationally, right? We have perhaps not quite identified our student needs as accurately as we probably should have historically. So I know that this is something that will help that, but it directly aligns to professional learning and development. And so it takes me to the regulation in section 4 of the regulation. No, section 7. So if you all don't mind, I'm going to jump around the regulation just a little bit. But
what regulation are you in? Can I ask? I'm sorry.
I'm just RA. So I know some of them are like
RA.
And I'm in RA.
RA. Okay.
And I appreciate that because I'm used to just saying RA, but you all have RB, so you have a bunch of them.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, the 7th section. All right. Number one, I just want to talk about something in theory for a second. What is the difference between professional development and professional learning? And why was professional development explicitly placed into this policy versus professional learning? Are we thinking of them being synonymous? Are they the same? Are we interchangeably use those words? Or is there intentionality around professional development, what that is for our staff, and what professional learning is for our staff? I just want to know your thoughts on that really quickly. Commissioner Brooks, if I might. Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Can I say, Commissioner McFadden, that I have been in some robust debates about that with my colleagues, including Ashley Stewart and friends from Teaching and Learning. And the debate went on for quite a long time about how people define professional development versus professional learning. I have my own opinion on what the two mean, but I have to admit, and I would love to hear Ms. Hines and Dr. Brooks share. My sense is that it probably wasn't quite so intentional in this document in terms of making that differentiation. I think of professional development as being that formal, organized thing that you do with staff, whereas I think of professional learning as being broader, and it encompasses both that PD, but also broader ongoing learning, which may be self-guided or maybe more experiential and sort of embedded in the work. So I think that's an interesting.
I don't want to take, because this isn't a teaching and learning meeting. I don't want to take up too much time with it.
Yeah.
When I saw it there, you know, it just makes me think about if we're over identifying, you know, students, if we're thinking about disproportionality, right? What is our intention in training staff, and how is that explicit in this policy? So we can talk about that in another meeting, but specifically my question is going, after I see what is here for identified personnel receiving training from the Office of Special Education when it comes to exclusion and restraint. It's specified from the way I'm looking at this for just those folks. But what about the other staff? What about the general educator? What about perhaps any other service providers? What about any other staff that is servicing our students? How are we being explicit about that training in the policy? Should we be explicit about it? Should we just leave it up to the interpretation of school-based staff? And as they need to reach out to the Office of Special Education or someone, they do that? Or should we be a bit more explicit in the policy about the training that teachers and staff and principals and leaders need to ensure that they're meeting the needs of our young people?
So thank you for raising that. So although the training and professional learning comes from the Office of Special Education, it is not only for special educators. I just want to be really clear about that. So it's for all staff that work with students with disabilities, to include general educators, to include related service providers, to include school-based administrators. So as we know, students that have behavior intervention plans are also general ed students can have a behavior intervention plan, because a student that has a student support team plan can have a behavior intervention plan, just as a student with a 504 plan. And so to be very clear, we do provide professional learning to all staff, to include, again, as I talked about, the de-escalation training, but also for those students and staff that can possibly need to restrain when appropriate, after implementing all of the other interventions. Could be a general educator that has been trained appropriately, could also be a support staff, a building administrator. So it is not only limited to a special educator. So the Office of Special Education does provide those professional learning opportunities to all school-based staff.
Dr. Brooks, I appreciate that. And it's also, it was referenced in RB, in that regulation in Section 9. So from what you just said, Dr. Brooks, it was not that clear to me as I read the policy. I'm not sure if we can include that. I would prefer that we add a bit more specificity to the policy, to the language, to include more of what you said, so that it does not leave it open, you know, to misinterpretation. That would be my suggestion. And then also in RA, I'm back in RA, in Section 3, the guidelines, it talks about when meetings are happening with the student, parents will be included if it is possible. I'm going to go to the language so I can, it's letter A, Section 2 of Roman numeral 3. This is lengthy, so I'm just trying to get there. So it's Roman numeral 3, letter A, and I'm looking at number 2. So it says, whenever possible, the parent and student will participate in the conference. So shouldn't the parent always be in that meeting, or at least they're notified?
Yes, so I don't have the regulation right in front of me. Is it the meeting? What type of suspension are we talking about?
I'm not in the suspension. I'm just in the RA, in the regulation to the additional. So it's guidelines for inappropriate behavior. So it's that section. So it may be somewhere else in the policy that you talk about notifying the parent, but
Absolutely.
yes, but in this particular section, it just says whenever possible, the parent and student will participate in the conference. So my point is just making sure in this section that we notify the parent and that the parent knows that the meeting is happening, and just being explicit about it in that section. And it may be somewhere else in the policy. However, I think it should be consistently, noted in the policy that whenever there is a meeting, regardless of the meeting, that the parent should be notified and then include it whenever possible. Because of course we know parents may not be able to because of whatever their schedule is, but I think that should be specified there. The same in section 4, letter A, and number 3. So prior to the student's readmission to class, this is for disruptive behavior, the principal must consult with the teacher. It is my opinion professionally that the principal should also consult with the parents prior to the student going back. I don't know how you all came up with that or what the legal parameters are around that. But I think that conversation should also happen so that the parent, I feel, is looked more at as a partner, right? We're in this together versus us doing this for your child because your child needs it, if that makes sense. It's my only point in statement. I'm finished, Chair. All right.
I'm sorry, can you just note that the last section that you said, what section? You said section 4?
Yes, it's RA section 4 under guidelines, disruptive behavior, letter A.
Okay.
This is number 3.
A3. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I just have a few thoughts. So one, just thank you all for the work. And it was coming back to me when we got the presentation last year. So just really grateful to see all the edits and all the changes. There were a couple of things that kind of stood out to me that I found striking. At several points throughout multiple regulations or policies and the regulations, there was this language around behavioral problems still listed there, and thinking about, that if we're really centering and focusing in on whole child and wholeness work, how might this policy need to be written differently to move away from a deficit-based perspective to be in an asset-based perspective? And that was happening throughout, where I was like, well, that doesn't sound right, because if we really believe that restorative approaches are core, central, and valuable to not only their emotional success, but as Commissioner James said, at the academic success as well, I feel like that we need to let that be communicated through the policy. So that's a piece that I would just add for consideration. There were a couple of questions around, I know that we're in a trying to crosswalk policies and make sure that we have language around equity and so forth. And one of the things that struck me about this was, as Commissioner McFadden stated, that we know that it requires more than having our policy sort of put together and tight, because it's cultural change. And I would also just add that when I was looking at the policy, I was struck by what I would see as that there was a pieces around restorative approaches, as I understand it, that was missing in terms of how robust it is, like defining what it is. If we say trauma informed, I would love to know what that is in the policy, because that's the guiding document for all of our behaviors to lead us to a culture of acceptance, inclusion, et cetera. And so my desire is that we just don't start crosswalking and putting in language but then like really think deeply about what does that really mean? And so for me, I just would love to see just more clarity about wholeness and those restorative approaches, and to talk about in some ways its significance, even if it's just a sentence around sort of what that means for this space.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Brooks, if I could just add, so when we added the information about the trauma informed, we did add definitions in there. So everything that we have mentioned in the policy, we were very intentional about defining it in the policy. So if you look under definitions.
Yeah,
I
did. And so I think what I was trying to say is, sort of how you're operationalizing, if you're using the state mandate, wholeness, for example, and trauma-informed care is more robust than the definition that's offered.
Okay.
And so that's what I'm trying to communicate, given that it's part of my background. So I'm looking at it like, this isn't sufficient, honey. And so like, that's where my mind goes. And so that's what I really wanted to offer to this space, because I know what it takes to shift a culture and the time and the energy and the resources. And so having a really robust definition of a concept is essential to helping move people through a process. And so not that the definitions weren't there, I just thought they were a little bit insufficient for what I know the work to be. So that's, and I was trying to find a way to say that as nicely as possible. Not that I don't think it's important. And so I just kind of wanted to name that. And taking a page out of Commissioner James's book, when she always says, the policy, particularly around the state stuff, is just the beginning, and it's the floor of the expectation, not the ceiling. And so, really appreciate it for her for always reminding us of that as well. And there. I did note some language around caregivers and parents. I just wanted to, whatever we choose, just to kind of be consistent, throughout all of the regs. Honestly, I got a little bit confused around mechanical restraints versus protective restraints. And I wish there was just a little bit more body to help me understand sort of what does that really mean for students who are experiencing those pieces, given that it's serious. And I just wanted a little bit more sort of texture to that. And so, I'm sorry,
I'm taking notes. You said mechanical versus?
The protective.
So the protective restraints. Okay.
Yeah. And there are a couple other things, but I'll make sure to jot down some notes, but I just kind of want to say a few more things. I would have loved to have seen something around sort of, I know that I had the privilege of checking out some of the circles around wholeness and the work with, staff, and I would love to have seen a little bit more of sort of that defined in terms of the training and implementation, right? So I know it's happening. I would love to know scope, scale, regularity of those things, so that I could get a sense of like where we actually are in implementing those core essential pieces around wholeness, de-escalation, for example, trauma-informed care, how we're tracking that and monitoring who's been through what trainings and that sort of thing. Because I think that's also important. And let's see. And I guess one of the other things is on the list of stakeholders, I wasn't sure if we, I didn't know if I read it in there, but where student voice showed up in this this policy.
So we met, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So we met with the, and again, this was last school year, we met with the Baltimore City School Student Council. And we met with, yes, students from there. We also had a focus group Actually, we had 2 focus groups for students that were held so that they could give their input as well. And
Great.
so I apologize if I omitted that from our stakeholders, but we definitely had student input.
Great, thank you. Because when I thought about restraints and I couldn't tell if parents had given consent for folks for their young people who might have developmental differences, if that was more specific to that. But I think about rights, right? Student rights. Where are they? How do we talk about them? How do we communicate them to make sure that students know what they can and what they're entitled to in terms of that conversation? And so I think that's probably all, just kind of some high level pieces, and then I'll send just kind of some other notes just that I had around some of the more technical pieces as well. But yeah, so are there any other things before we thank our wonderful team? Oh, that's actually not true. I have one more question. And so given my complete and utter bias for wholeness and whole child, I would actually love to hear a little bit about sort of how, and I think, Sarah, you had initially started to say about like, this is an entry point. I would love to hear about sort of the bigger vision, because for me, I see restorative practices as our way out of so much. And I would just love to hear a little bit more about, in a perfect world, like what could this look like? Doesn't have to be long. I just think it's so important. I think it's really, really important.
Oh, I just think we could talk about this all night. Yeah. So when you say in a perfect world, though, I just want to make sure I'm getting the scale and the scope right, so I don't go on too long. Wait, are you thinking in particular about how we reduce our reliance on suspensions and move towards a more restorative approach to behavior and discipline? Yeah. Let me try to be brief. I think about this a lot. And actually, it's funny because just this morning I got to have my first call with our incoming CAO, which was really great. And this is one of the things I was talking with her about, as well as the issue that you raised, Commissioner James, about I think a lot about transitions and how hard transitions are for our children, our young people, in all kinds of ways, right? Transition is hard for lots of people, but it's that much harder if you have been through any kind of experience of trauma or destabilization in your life. And so one of the things that we're aware of is not only how we're still using suspensions too often in some cases, where I think maybe there could have been a different approach used, but also when that does have to occur, how are we helping transition back to a more restorative conversation? So if we do end up feeling like we have to use a suspension for some reason, which is still where we're at for right now, that's our reality, but at least can we start to build from there to how do we restore relationships? How do we restore and repair harm done? I mean, when I look at the big picture, the reality is that, as you said earlier, this requires a massive cultural shift. Not only on the part, frankly, of people within the system, but of people around the system. I've heard, comments at board meetings over the past 3 years where there was a lot of resistance to the idea of restorative practices. And I think a lot of fear about not using suspensions as the first sort of, most common approach to dealing with challenges. So I think it's sort of it's a combination of things, which includes, one, making sure people actually understand what restorative practices and restorative approaches are, because there are huge misconceptions that it means we're just letting kids run amok and we're letting them off the hook, and we don't care how they behave. We're not going to keep our people safe, which are obviously not the things that we believe about what it means or how it should function within our ecosystem here. But it doesn't, just because I believe that doesn't take away the fact that that's how other people believe or feel about what a more restorative approach would mean. So part of what we're doing right now is just trying to reach a lot more people with really good quality professional development around restorative practices. We're also trying to give our school leaders and our teachers in particular more of an opportunity to feel it and to experience it for themselves, because for some folks it's actually that going through a healing circle with a really great facilitator and feeling how it makes a difference to yourself personally in the middle of the incredibly difficult time we're going through, that helps to shift that mindset more than it is to go through a training. So it's trying to give people more direct experiences of what it really is and what it feels like, and trying to get that out to more people across the district. A pretty heavy and intensive focus, and again, this is both on the wholeness side of our work as well as in our partnership with Dr. Brooks's team around CCEIS, really focusing in on leaders and how leaders approach this work. Because if our school leaders don't believe that this is the way to go, it doesn't go, right? And we have seen that sometimes where there are folks at the staff level who really want to do this work and are trying to make it move. But if their leader's not buying in or seeing it as a priority, it can be very hard to move the work. So we know our school leaders need to be partners in this, as do, frankly, our district leaders. And so we're also currently working on trying to set up some opportunities for our executive directors, our ILEDs and academic EDs to experience some restorative processes with our really, amazing partners who facilitate this work so well. The partners are also working on a much more condensed sort of session that would allow our cabinet members who may not be as familiar with restorative practices to learn about it. We'd love to do something similar with the board if the board is interested, So we're trying to work at this from lots of different angles right now. And I think, in my mind, I just keep reminding myself the two always have to go hand in hand, like the adaptive work around trying to shift mindset and culture, but it always has to be anchored in the technical work as well. So training people on the how and the what, and supporting and coaching. And we've got a huge amount of coaching going on right now, both across 36 of our intensive learning sites for student wholeness, as well as the schools that are involved in the CCEIS. They're getting focused coaching around restorative practices and how to actually implement this at the school level. So I'll stop because I could keep going, but.
No, I really appreciate it. I think for a city with students who experience a lot of trauma in our staff, I think this has to become a part of and be embedded in all parts of our entity to kind of see, to shift us out of this spaces of being deeply triggered and sort of acting out in ways that are sort of causing harm in our spaces, and to redirect that energy to some other sort of more constructive modes. And so I just want to say thank you all for that work. And I know each and every one of you all have a touch point in that. And I think that's really, really important. And I'll say two more things before we move on. One, thinking about the implementation and tracking. I think I've been just randomly looking at other districts' work in terms of tracking the types of practices that are often used. So I would love to see a disaggregated sort of list of sort of which, so it's expulsion is one of the ways, but we know that there's a compendium of other pathways to treat or to respond to disciplinary actions. And so I'd like to see which ones principals and school leaders are using more than others, because I think that'll give you another data point to then try to intervene as one potential piece. And of course, I wouldn't be myself if I didn't also acknowledge that, looking back at our report from last year that we got from you all, and, thinking about equity and right now making sure that we're always considering different additional demographics. I know that we have race and students with disabilities, but also around that piece around when I was looking at the bullying category, again, sexual orientation, gender identity, those pieces are sort of hidden in there. So I think just on a back end data end. Like I would love to still see how we streamline data collection across all of our systems so that we can break all of the information down to see if there are disparities between those intersecting dimensions as well. So again, thank you all so much for all that you do and really appreciate the time. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, thank you for the great conversation. And so I would like to just move us on to our next topic, which we'll be discussing, what is it, EBBBB or EBBB? I think it's 3 Bs on incident reports. And so move it over. Christian, do we have anybody for?
Yes, good afternoon. This is Jerome Jones from the Office of Human Capital, specifically Labor Relations. And I'm here to talk about EBB.
Great.
Yeah. Christian, do you have the PowerPoint to put up? Or
I can pull it up. Give me one second.
Okay, so I'm here to talk about EBB and B. And while on the slide it has Jeremy Grant Skinner and my name, to put this together, it was myself and Sally Robinson out of the Office of Legal Counsel, and also Lisa Smith-Sherrod out of Chief of Schools Office, because as this policy does, it is to provide a coordination to and consolidation of all of the reporting requirements that exist in other policies and regulations. And there are also current and or revised new incident reports that require us to complete forms for federal, state, and local requirements, and also board requirements. And for principals, this is really critical, mainly for principals, to try and put together one place that they can go to if they believe there's a form that must be filled out, if there are reporting requirements. The goal is to make that this policy is the place they would go to, and it would either spell out what they have to do, or it would refer them to another policy, and or regulation. Next slide, please. So the types of incidents that we're talking about here are workplace accident or injury. And when we say workplace accident or injury, we are talking about to employees, to whether they are permanent or temporary employees, and also to contractors, to students, to parents. Those are in different places, but we have to cover all of those in this policy. Child abuse and neglect, misconduct, discrimination, harassment for students, sex-based discrimination. See the list of current policies and regulations, and there are also other reporting requirements that exist that require employees, supervisors to complete forms, and also refers them to the fraud hotline if they want to report something that will require an investigation and reporting. Next slide. The policy really it defines principals, supervisors, school grounds, critical injury, and reporting a reportable incident. So throughout the policy, it refers to all of these categories, gives a definition under the policy so that everyone knows what we're talking about here. Next slide. So the regulation includes employees' responsibility to report incidents, identifies the appropriate board policy and regulation, the processes and forms that must be completed, It really serves as a central repository for principals and supervisors for incident reporting requirements. That is, there are a myriad of forms and policies within the district that principals are required, some from state requirements, some from board requirements to fill out. And so we want this regulation to be that place where if there is doubt, they go to. Next slide. The regulation will be amended as new policy and regulations are adopted that contain reporting requirements. Will update as current policies and regulations are revised. What we have done is try and identify what we know of right now. And in some cases, what we'll do is refer the employees, the principals and supervisors to the appropriate policy and regulation so that they can read through, because otherwise this regulation would have to have all of the applicable policies and regulations embedded in it, and that is really not the goal. The goal is to make sure that if there's a policy and regulation that exists, we refer the principal or supervisor to that policy and regulation so that they can walk through, because there are nuances in all of those policies and regs that they really need to be aware of in reporting and filling out the reports and completing the incidences. In some cases, such as in workers' compensation, where an employee gets injured, there is not a policy or regulation to address that. And within this policy and regulation, we will step them through what the requirements are, what you have to do, and also include the forms that need to be filled out and who they go to. So again, as we stated before, the policy is to refer to different policies and regulations, or if those policies and regulations don't exist, to have the process that the principal or supervisor must walk through in order to report incidences in the applicable forms if necessary. We still, as part of this, again, we looked at who contributes and where a lot of our policies and regulations exist that require reporting. And of course, the chief of schools has been intimately involved in this because you have all IFDs and also Lisa Smith-Sherrod, who is the director of support. She was intimately familiar with a lot of the things that principals have to complete. We are going to the Pizzazz Executive Board because, again, those administrators complete a lot of the forms that we need to complete. School Police has forms that are there. Baltimore City Legal and Health Department, because in the workers' comp, we partner with Baltimore City also Legal Counsel to look at our workers' comp cases on a regular basis. And if an individual is hurt in our schools that is either a student or parent or visitor, we refer them to Baltimore City's Central Bureau of Investigations. So we need them as part of any stakeholder engagement. And then, of course, the Charter Advisory Committee and PCAP we also go to. And I know that's quick, but again, the purpose of this is really to encapsulate in place what already exists, and even the things that are not policy, we have guidance documents that we can build into. And this particular policy and accompanying regulation will grow in time. As things come up, as laws change, we will be updating and changing the policy and regulation to incorporate all the changes that we're mandated to do.
Great, thank you so much. I'd love to hear from our other commissioners. Commissioner McFadden, did you have any questions?
Appreciate you, Dr. Brooks. The policy in the RA is pretty straightforward. I understand the purpose of it. Mr. Jones, I'm curious though about engaging with our other bargaining units. What's your thinking about simply including Pizzazza and school police and not some of our other bargaining units, just to get their feedback and their thinking around it?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. Generally, I guess when we originally looked at it, we were looking at those that have to complete forms more than the other bargaining units. This certainly is very easy, and we'll add the other bargaining units to, in some cases, make sure that they're aware that if they get hurt, there's a form that you need to make sure it gets filled out, because we want you to go to Mercy Medical and have that addressed. Because what you might not be aware of, if you get hurt at work and you file it under your insurance, you will have a heck of a time trying to get the bill paid and trying to get that fixed. So yes, that's a good point, and we will reach out to the other bargaining units.
That was precisely why. That was precisely why I was thinking about at least letting them know, educating them on what this is, and to your point, everything that you just said. But that's it for me. I appreciate you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner James. Questions?
Sure, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm on the regulations page, Mr. Jones, and thank you for the work that you've done and put into this. Under Roman numeral 1, letter D, I'm wondering if there shouldn't be a letter E added for a whistleblower clause. It says here that, basically it's a sort of a, for lack of better finesse, a CYA bullet point in letter D, where employees are not supposed to make statements or indemnify the organization. Should there also be a place for employees to be able to say, this incident happened and this student was hurt and we are culpable for it, and ensure in the policy that there will not be retribution by the principal? And I don't know legally where that stands, but it feels like if we're going to both cover ourselves as an organization, we should also cover the employees we support, who are going to do the right thing and step up for kids. So not sure on that, just throwing that out there as something to consider, something that feels like it's missing, especially in the language of letter D. My next is under Roman numeral 2, under guidelines, letter E. And as you mentioned, we send folks to Mercy. The board, to my knowledge, has not approved a contract with Mercy as being the workman's comp location. And there are several other healthcare providers in the area that do workman's comp pieces. So is there a reason we're directing them to Mercy specifically?
Okay, so I would like to explain that from my mind, I divide workers' comp into two pieces. The third-party administrator, which is not Mercy, that is Sedgwick, and the medical review officer, which really is Mercy. And Mercy acts as the medical review officer for city schools. I am not aware of the contract and where we are with the contract as a medical review officer. So what they do is they see the employees, make a determination or treat them, and then pass it off to Sedgwick, who is now the third-party administrator, working both with the employee's attorney, if they engage an attorney, and also following that case into workers' compensation, into the commission if necessary. So are you talking about as the medical review officer, or as the or who we deal with as far as the third-party administrator of workers' comp?
Sort of both. I don't recall the board being asked to approve an RFP from a medical review administrator, or is that a state, a quasi-state relationship, or is it just something we determined as city schools and it's just sort of been ongoing?
So I know from coverage, for coverage purposes, we piggyback onto Baltimore City for workers' comp. We do not have a separate coverage for workers' comp. So we piggyback onto Baltimore City. I guess what I need to do for you is to find out, does that go up when it goes to the city for buy-off of the contract? Are we included as part of that review? But I do know we piggyback on the city for our workers' compensation, because I sometimes get the reports from for Baltimore City Schools, Fire Department, Police Department, all of the city agencies. We fall into the same report.
Yeah. So it makes,
Because-
go ahead, Josh. Jump in. Sorry.
Commissioner James, I believe this is part of the long-standing arrangements with the city that go all the way back to the separation, but we will clarify this as part of what we do in terms of revisions.
And I think just as best practice, if that is the case, stating that rather than, because it sounds like this is a policy endorsing a particular provider, which, you know, even in the last policy, we don't say PBIS out loud because it's a specific provider. We say restorative approaches. So saying go to Mercy leads it, you know, that's a different sort of level of public endorsement of a particular vendor for that service. So saying go to Mercy per the city-state agreement or something in the language so it doesn't look like we're using policy to leverage financial support of one possible entity. Does that make sense, Josh?
Yeah, it makes sense. One of the things we can do is go through, and where we refer to Mercy, we can change that in the policy and regs to refer to the medical review officer. And then someplace else, as that changes in the forms, if it is still Mercy, we can refer people that this is the address, it is Mercy. So that at least in the policy and regulations is a generic reference.
Perfect. Yeah, that would address that. And then my last question, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yep.
Okay. Under Roman numeral 3, other reportable incidents, especially down in the principal supervisor completing the online form, offices will debrief. There's no timelines there. And so it might be helpful in the implementation of the policy to, you know, under say letter C, school's office will debrief with the school principal or any other reported individuals within 7 days or within 10 days. Something to make sure that there's a sense of urgency so that it doesn't just sift into the background and never get dealt with, where, especially in situations where we might have multiple young people or multiple faculty and staff injured for the same reason. You know, there's a protruding pipe somewhere that people keep catching their arm on and slicing themselves. Just making sure that there's some timelines to that. And that would be my only suggestions or questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I also similarly, I don't have much. One of the biggest questions I had was, given that this would look like a consolidation of so many different forms, thinking about is it like a database where all of that information is going to be consolidated and live, or will it live like, you know, there'll be directions to the forms, but also still enter into different places. Just knowing that as we have been talking about how, at least on the policy side, when we get implementation or we get our regulation reports, there's so many of them. And so in some ways, this feels like, might be a strategy to consider as we begin to think about streamlining across the multitude of policies that we have, so that we're not reproducing the work. But so just one, you know, how is this going to be managed in terms of like all of this going live into one database?
I believe that's a really good question to talk to the users of the forms and looking at the forms and where they have to go, because different forms have to go to different entities. But that is a really good question when we sit down and talk to principals and supervisors, that this policy and accompanying regulation is really meant to help them to maneuver through all of the different policies and regulations and forms that they have to complete. And so it's really, that's a really good question that we will say specifically, how can this be structured so that you are not duplicating forms, you have one place to go, and when you fill it out, that the form then moves to the right person without having to make this particular policy and regulation have every other policy and regulation within it.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, because I just was thinking about I think it's a great idea. I think it's super helpful to just have a place that's completely outlined, but just also thinking about it would be also great if folks wouldn't have to do, we're getting a new ERP system. Would that be a place where something like this could live so that we could have some uniformity and data collection, as well as metrics and so forth. And I guess my only other question around this particular piece was similar to Commissioner James. I know that they're just timelines and specifics, and I know you can't necessarily get into that. But if there are places where, whether it's inside of a virtual platform or ERP system or wherever, where there's a little bit more structure on timing of things, I think that would just be helpful. And so those are only my two thoughts about this particular piece. Any other questions?
May I add comments, please?
Oh, did you not go, Chechenia? I'm sorry, I missed you.
No, no problem. Just to your last point, I'm going to applaud you for this, because I will say, as a retired administrator, if there had been a place where there was a listing of all of the reporting types of things, would have been very, very helpful. And it might be if there's a way somewhere within this document that could even chart in some ways what people are saying, the reporting, what the reporting instrument is, and sort of the timeline for it, and a reference as to policy if folks need to go to get more details around it. I also want to agree with Commissioner McFadden in terms of, having some discussion with other folks. I'm just thinking of some of the reporting documents actually do require, and I'm thinking, for example, of the suspicion of child abuse, which does go beyond just the supervisor at times. And so even though we have training that's mandated, I think it would be good to have some input from some of the folks from the other bargaining units around that. That's all I wanted to add. But I think this is a great idea, especially for new folks coming on board in a supervisory role, to be able to see the full listing of the kinds of incident reports that might be required.
And I can share with you a lot of our seasoned people too, because a lot of these things they just don't see very often. And there are numerous calls. Say, Jerome, where do I find this, or where do I find that? Because there are many, and quite frankly, around workers' compensation, there are a lot of questions where supervisors don't believe the person hurt themselves at work, and well, I'm not saying, well, you can't, you have to send them down. So for seasoned people, oftentimes they don't see a lot of the things that they're mandated to report, and this will keep them, make sure they follow the right process, make sure that our employees get the protections and, the processes that we're required to. So it will help. I think it will help all of us.
Yeah.
no one person sees all of these things.
Yeah, I think it will also help in terms of the compliance reports that we have to turn in as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would look, I'm not sure if Allison is still on, or if Allison on earlier? But I think it would be like great, you know, on that compliance report in terms of streamlining. I know that we were having that conversation, so I don't know where y'all had landed with that, but I thought this was like a great, you know, at least starting place or discussion point that could be useful.
Yeah, no, it is really helpful. We are still working on thinking about how all the client compliance reports could be more streamlined, to your point, to make them more useful, to actually give us enough time to be able to do them, to make them more useful. So this work and this policy will be really helpful in that effort. Agreed.
Thank you. Are there any other folks? And Chair Chinny, so sorry again that I missed you. I'm just a little hungry. And so I need some calories in my system. Are there any other questions or anything like that? Great. So Christian, am I missing anything? Is you need to cover anything?
No, we didn't have anyone sign up for public comment.
Great. So thank you so much, Jerome. We really appreciate the time. I just want to say thank you for both of our presentations. Also want to echo with Chair Chinia mentioned in the comment section, which was to really think about sort of how we might create a dedicated space to have some additional conversations about restorative practices and approaches, given that it's such a large and significant piece and body of the work, and I think has far-reaching implications beyond the policy that we were discussing today. I just wanted to highlight that as a key component, at least around the discipline piece. With that being said, I just want to remind folks that they can sign up in advance to participate as public comment beginning at 9 a.m. The Thursday before the meeting. That'll run through 5 p.m. The Monday before the meeting. Individuals or groups interested in providing comments to the committee can sign up 3 ways. They can contact our office. They can visit, I guess we're still not visiting buildings yet, or you can email our board office at schoolboard@bcps.k12.md.us. Up to 5 individuals will have given opportunity to provide comment on the policy. Each speaker will have 3 minutes, and all public comments should address a policy related to the issue that we're discussing, or the comment should relate to the policy that we're discussing. And so just want to sort of remind folks that our next meeting will be, Christian, I don't see that. Where is that on this form?
Sorry, Dr. Brooks, but there's somebody just way cuter on the camera than you right now, which is hard to believe there's somebody cuter, but there is. So.
Yay, we have a visitor.
This is a future Baltimore City student. This is Romello, one of my grandsons.
Oh, hey, Romello. It's beautiful.
Sorry to interrupt. I just had to say that.
He's coming to tell me, are you finished yet? Sorry about that.
No, it's great. I just was reading off the script, so I couldn't even see. So thank you, Commissioner James. So I just wanted to remind folks that our next meeting is February 16th at 3:30. It will be a virtual meeting, and we'll be discussing policy GCCC, it looks like, staff travel and KCA family and engagement. And I believe that conversation will be a pretty robust conversation. So we're looking forward to hopefully visitors and folks giving public comment. With that, I will adjourn this meeting at 4:59, and thank you all for coming and participating. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you all later.
Everyone.
Thank you.